At the end of Aincrad, after failing spectacularly to best Heathcliff in a duel, Asuna dies protecting Kirito from his blunder. However, Kirito shortly dies anyway, having lost the will to fight, though he does manage to take Heathcliff down in his last moments and Aincrad falls, freeing all those who were trapped within it after a 2-year-long campaign within the Iron Prison. But quite some time before these events, Kirito obtains a revival item from the Christmas event which he ultimately gives to Klein. This revival item can bring someone back from the dead in Aincrad as long as it's within 10 seconds of their death. So what if Klein used this item on Kirito after Heathcliff murdered him? Is it even possible? Just what would change if Kirito came back, if anything at all? Well, the short answer is no, it's not possible. Everyone in that room, including Klein, was paralyzed, so they couldn't interfere with Heathcliff explaining the situation and then leaving. I'm pretty sure he wasn't planning to lift that paralysis until he left the dungeon. I'm going to assume he was going to leave via teleportation to the Ruby Palace, as walking through 25 floors seems very tedious, but even if I assume that, I think the process of teleporting away takes at least 6 seconds, if not more, leaving Klein with barely 4 seconds to get up, dig the revival item out of his inventory and use it on Kirito. Maybe he can do it, but it seems a bit unlikely. That, however, is not fun. So I'm going to explore just how this could happen and what events would proceed as a result of it. Obviously I'm going to have to take some creative liberties with the events in order to make this work, so allow me to do that please. I promise I won't make them too egregious. So, first of all, would Klein even still have the revival item? When Kirito gave it to him, he told Klein to use the revival item on the first player that died in front of him. That was when the front line was at the 46th floor. By the time Kirito dies, it's at the end of the 75th floor. That's a long time. Surely somebody would have died in front of Klein somewhere in that time, right? Well, not necessarily. Klein and his guild are all frontliners and would spend the majority of their time on the front line, contributing towards the clearing. In general, the front line was very elite and extremely careful, as there wasn't a massive amount of people serious about clearing the game and also had the ability to do so. As if they were just going to lose people every floor, then they would very quickly find themselves without any players left to clear the game with. Also, in a situation where dying in the game in turn also means dying for real, the front line emphasized caution above all. They would not do much unless they knew it was absolutely safe. There was as little risk-taking as possible, if any at all. Casualties were unacceptable. Even in boss fights, they would not even attempt it until the floor boss had been thoroughly scouted and they had all the available information that they could possibly get. And this extremely cautious approach, with multiple safety nets set up in place, is the reason the front line took 0 casualties in the vast majority of boss fights in the game. Also, Aincrad was balanced around the fact that dying in the game meant dying in real life. It was a tough as nails game for sure, but it was reasonably tough as nails. If you did everything within your power to optimally clear the game without dying, generally you should not expect to die. How do I know this? Well, obviously just initially it is a reasonable assumption. But also I can confidently state this as fact, as when Aincrad was added to Alphem Online, Asuna commented on the fact that everything in it is much harder, thus the progress through it is slower than expected. This is because in Alphem they have more tools at their disposal than they had in Aincrad, such as magic and flight, just to name some big examples. But also, the biggest and most key change is that they could respawn. So the difficulty is amped up to balance around those key facts and the fact that you won't die for real if you fumble in ALO. So in general, it's actually unlikely that Klein would just happen upon someone dying in front of him in the front line. Now, there are some instances where he might find himself before someone dying in front of him. For example, in the fight against the 50th floor boss, this fight was one of the few times the front line took casualties during a boss fight, and a lot of casualties at that, to the point where there was actually a panic and it would have ended in a total wipe had Heathcliff not held the line. It's totally possible that Klein could have used the revival item on one of these casualties in that fight. But it's also possible that he could have his hands full in keeping both his and his own guild's lives safe in this disaster of a boss fight. The next instance to consider is the Red Murder Guilds. They were always up to some kind of fuckery. The main issue I have with this is that the revival item has a really tight window on it. 10 seconds is not that long of a time. The person has to pretty much die in front of you for you to make it in time. I have to assume that nobody in Klein's guild fell victim to one of these attacks from the murder guilds, as to my knowledge at least, I haven't heard of it happening, and we would see them much later on in the 74th floor clearing. And I think it's unlikely he would just stumble upon the murdering of another player, yet along have enough time to revive them. So the most likely time he would get to use it in my eyes is when the frontline went to go purge the most infamous Red Murder Guild, Laughing Coffin. When the frontliners arrived at the Laughing Coffin headquarters, they were ambushed, resulting in an all-out messy melee between both sides. During this fight, the frontline did take casualties due to a mix of being caught off guard and hesitation. It's possible that Klein could have used the revival item on somebody who fell in this melee, but again, 10 seconds is not a lot of time. I can also see it being possible that he did not have a window of opportunity to use the item on somebody who died, as he would be very busy in his own fights. The way Kirito described it, any lapse of focus just equaled death in that melee. So I can't rule out the possibility of Klein retaining the revival item even after this fight. So to sum it up, yeah, there are a couple of situations where I can see him using the revival item already. But due to the reasons I pointed out, I also don't think it's unreasonable to think that he could still have had the revival item by the time Heathcliff and Kirito duel. So now we move on to the next question. Just how would have Klein used the item on Kirito? This is where I'm going to have to change things slightly. Heathcliff and Kirito would have their duel just like before. Kirito would proceed to lose due to getting tilted from the deadlock they found themselves in that duel. Then, when Heathcliff was about to land the fatal blow on Kirito, Asuna would take the blade for him and die in his place. The trauma of seeing his lover die before him for his blunder in his arms would make Kirito lose the will to live, resulting in him getting stabbed by Heathcliff. However, this time, instead of waiting for Kirito to explode into fragments, Heathcliff would just say something like, "What a shame," and teleport to the Ruby Castle, since the duel was done. When he did so, he would free everyone from their paralysis. Klein, having been watching this whole time, was shocked, but planned on saving Asuna with the revival item from the moment she fell. The issue was, the paralysis stopped him from being able to do so. So by the time Heathcliff had left and Kirito had finally fell, the 10-second window had expired. So even if he still wanted to revive Asuna now, he could not. But he might still barely just have enough time to save Kirito. So the very instant he was able to move, he would dash madly to do so, operating the windows as he did so, just barely making it in time to use the item on Kirito, saving him from his electric execution and by extension the front line's hopes of being able to clear the game. So what happens from here? Well, first of all, I think Kirito would be very confused as to why he is alive. Klein would explain the situation and that confusion would be replaced with anger, both at himself and at Klein. How could he have allowed this situation to unfold? Because he gave in to frustration in that duel, Asuna was now dead. He had sworn to himself never to allow a similar tragedy that befell Sachi and the Black Cats befall her, but now she was gone, and her death was on his hands. At the very least, he wanted to follow her into the afterlife, but he was denied even that as Klein had brought him back to this hell of a reality. This event would break Kirito, and so after a short, angry outburst at Klein, I think he would just collapse and let the melancholy take him. Meanwhile, the Knights of the Blood members would be distraught. Not only had their leader betrayed them, the man who had carefully nurtured this guild to the elite superpower it was today, and all their utmost respect as well as trust, instead had been manipulating them all like pawns this whole time. A massive blow that both them and the front line would heavily feel just on its own, but also they had lost their sub-leader, Asuna, the Flash. One of their strongest members of the guild, one of the strongest players in the front line in general, the person who had consistently pushed all of them to give their absolute best efforts to the clearing and led by example. She got the best out of them and even organised a lot of the floor boss raids. Both of these losses in the same day would be soul-crushing for the Knights of the Blood. I imagine it might even threaten to dismantle their organisation altogether. At the very least, for the time being, I imagine the majority of them would lose motivation to continue the clearing, questioning how this could have happened, how none of them could have noticed. Some may even hold resentment towards Kirito for having lost the duel against Heathcliff and therefore allowing the death of their beloved sub-leader to occur, not even dying for his mistake. But I feel a good amount of them wouldn't hold this against him too much, as in the first place he was the one who had discovered Heathcliff was Kayaba and even put his life on the line to free them all from this iron prison, even if he didn't stay dead. There might even be some who even still hold resentment against Klein though, as from their perspective, he had a method to revive someone from the dead but chose to use it on Kirito instead of Asuna. They did not know about the 10-second time limit, as it's a unique one-of-a-kind item. Klein couldn't prove this was the case either, as he no longer had the item due to it being a one-use deal. Due to the shocking revelation that was the exposing of Kayaba, I think the clearing of Aincrad would pause. The front line would need some time to just process the whole situation, clear their heads and make sure they didn't come to any emotional rash decisions that would result in more tragedies. Not only was Heathcliff at the head of the strongest guild in the game and individually one of the strongest players in the game, but his leadership skills were also second to none. He had an aura and presence about him that would calm those around him, make them believe that with him by their side, they could prevail no matter how hard the task at hand. At boss fights, he would give speeches that would rally morale and bring out the best of those there to witness it. He was a true leader of men in that sense. This, along with Asna's substantial efforts towards the clearing and her individual prowess as a player, was a blow the likes of which the front line had never experienced before. From here on out, the clearing process would be much harder, and they would need time to steel themselves and even just find the motivation to go on. After the tragedy that was the death of the Black Cat, Kirito only stuck around because he was driven to find out what Sachi's last words were. Due to all the noise around him during that slaughter, he was unable to hear them, just see that she had said something. He thought that she had probably cursed him for allowing all their deaths to transpire. If it were not for him, she at least specifically would probably still be alive, hiding out in an inn somewhere, as she wanted to leave both the guild and the field for a fear of losing her life. It was Kirito who had convinced her to stay, swearing to her that he wouldn't allow her death to happen. Thus, it was because of him that she was present in that dungeon for that tragedy to occur. The guilt consumed him, driving him into an almost manic fashion to spend every possible waking moment working towards obtaining the revival item to bring her back. When he finally did get it and learned of the 10-second limit, therefore finally setting in stone the reality that Sachi was gone forever, he was done. That was it. There was no salvation. He decided to just straight up kill himself by going on as many suicidal clearing endeavors that he could until he finally croaked. Sachi's message on Christmas Eve, however, would pull him out of that darkness, and he would move forward, however painful that was. Asuna meant way more to Kirito than the Black Cats or Sachi ever did. It's almost incomparable. So if Kirito suffered that much and basically decided on suicide from their deaths, Asuna's one would lead him down a very dark road indeed. I feel as if he would go back to the 22nd floor, back to the log house in which Kirito and Asuna created some brief but wholesome memories together. The happiest he had ever been in his life thus far. After going through the house, taking in all the nostalgia, the beds in which they slept, the photos of all the fun activities they did together, the kitchen in which Asuna made unbelievably delicious food too good for the world of the game, the chairs in which they would just sit together, enjoying every moment of each other's company, he would say his final goodbyes to it all. Finally, he would arrive at the front lawn of his house. There, he would open his inventory. Since he and Asuna were married, their inventories got combined as part of Aincrad's marriage mechanic. When a spouse dies, their items go to the survivor. So now Kirito would take out Asuna's treasured Lambert light rapier as well as his own elucidator, planting them both in the ground, side by side, as a sort of symbol of their time together in this place of dreams. With pain and regret in his heart, he would leave them behind and head to the floor's end. There, he would look out into the infinite azure that was the sky. Here, the emotions plaguing his heart would spill out in the form of tears running down his cheeks. I imagined in his mind he would give a brief apology to Klein. He had brought Kirito back, but without Asuna, he just couldn't go on. It was his blunder that resulted in her death. The least he could do was follow her into the next world. And so, in his final moments, he would give a brief smile at the thought of their reunion, and then throw himself into the bottomless abyss. Some time would pass, and the frontliners would more than likely hold a meeting. They now had had a while to sit with what had happened, gauge their feelings about whether or not they wanted to continue with the loss of two key assets. I think some of the Knights of the Blood would be missing from this meeting, as they decided to retire from the clearing, viewing it as an impossible task without Heathcliff, but also Asuna to a lesser extent. As the 75th boss fight was extremely ropey, it is the first time that they had taken casualties in a boss fight since the 50th floor. They had only managed to deal with it due to a combined effort of Heathcliff, Kirito and Asuna doing the seemingly impossible task of holding the boss's attention while the rest of the front line did damage to it. They were now missing two of that key trio, and had they had been missing them in the boss fight, the front line would more than likely have been wiped there and then. The remaining Knights of the Blood members, however, I think would have steeled their resolves for clearing the rest of the game, partly for their own desires of wanting to escape the Cyan prison, but also partly as to not let their beloved sub-leader's death be in vain. I also think that there would be some among them who wanted to make it to the end simply to be able to fight Heathcliff and take revenge for playing them all like this, a sentiment many among the front line I think would share. The thought of being able to stick a blade through the man who had entrapped them all here and caused so much suffering was surely an enticing one. There was something the remaining Knights of the Blood had to bring up though, that being Klein's decision to revive Kirito instead of Asuna. Sure, Kirito was the biggest contributor towards the clearing. Not only was he in possession of the dual blade skill and individually consistently made a lot of progress on the floors as well as the labyrinths, but also he had a relatively unique approach to sharing information. In SEO, a game where your life is literally on the line, information is one of the most valuable things within it. Information could be anything, like quest unlock conditions, mapping data, item unlock conditions, skill unlock conditions, item locations, efficient farming spots, you name it. It's not easy to obtain, and having it could be the difference between whether or not you live past certain situations. Because of this, information fetched a high price, and not many people are willing to just give it out easily. There were even people like Argo who made a whole career out of obtaining and selling information, but Kirito did not believe in selling or withholding information for reward. He believed that sharing it was the right thing to do, and would hope that by doing this, if he was ever in a position where he needed certain information he didn't have, somebody would return the favor. Taking this approach to sharing the information he obtained would speed up not only the clearing, but also the process of players getting stronger and joining the front line. Asuna commented during their time on their break from the front line that the 75th floor's clearing was much slower than usual. She felt a little guilty upon learning of this for monopolizing Kirito's time, as she knew how much of an impact he has on the clearing. But not everybody knew that. He was a solo player for the majority of his time in the Iron Prison. He also never claimed credit when he shared information, thus his actions and impact wouldn't be known that well by the rest of the front line, even though they would clearly feel it now that he was gone. Where, in contrast, Asuna's actions were much more obvious to those around her. She led her guild through the clearing both by example and with strategical planning, as well as pushed them to get the best out of them, not to mention also leading and planning most of the fights against the floor's bosses. In the eyes of the Knights of the Blood, and I'm pretty sure even the eyes of a decent amount of the front line, reviving Asuna was clearly the better choice. So, to them, not only had Klein sealed the fate of their beloved sub-leader, but had also significantly stunted the prowess of the front line. Klein would try to refute their accusations by stating the choice was not between Asuna or Kirito, but between Kirito and nothing, due to the 10-second time condition of the revival item, to which he would obviously choose Kirito. But again, as I said before, he could not prove that this was the case as the item expires after one use. I imagine some of the front line would take him at his word, but some may not. Certainly, I think the remains of the Knights of the Blood would probably think his words were bullshit. So tensions between them and Klein's guild would rise high. This argument between the two groups would be going nowhere, with either side unwilling to give ground. So I think someone with clout among the frontliners would step up to intervene. Probably someone highly ranked within a respected top guild like the Divine Dragon Alliance, for example. They would state that this argument was pointless. What's done is done, and it's not like Kirito was a weak player. He had the dual wielding skill, risked his life to free them all from the Iron Prison, and they had all seen his outstanding efforts in helping to keep the 75th floor boss's attention. Fighting over who should have been revived any longer would only further divide the front line, and with the loss of the two key assets to it just recently, division among those who remained was just not something they could afford. So with that agreeable sound reasoning laid before them, the Knights of the Blood would back down from their accusations, though I'm sure the resentment would still remain. But also, it would be at this moment someone would probably realize that Kirito was not at the meeting. I don't think anyone would suspect the worst immediately, as Klein would mention he was close with Asuna, so he was probably taking his time grieving over her death. But after the meeting had concluded, just to make sure he was doing okay, Klein would shoot a message to Kirito. It would be here that Klein would be horrified at the realization that he couldn't find Kirito on his friends list. Not wanting to fear the worst just yet, he would immediately dash to look around the places that Kirito frequented. Liz's smith shop, Agil's store, the 74th floor's popular resting spots. But no matter where he looked, Kirito would be nowhere to be found. At this point, the sun would begin to set and Klein would prepare to face the music, arriving at the obsidian monolith located at the first floor. Here, all the names of the players within Aincrad were recorded, with the ones that were dead being crossed out. He would search for Kirito's name, praying to any gods out there who would listen that Kirito's name would not be crossed out. But, to his great despair, he would be. The front line was currently on break from the clearing, so Klein could immediately piece together just what had happened. He just couldn't believe it. Not like this. Klein would scream into the sky, cursing Kayaba for all that had happened. Some time would pass, and I believe the frontliners would resume the clearing of the game. They had time to take a break now, collect themselves, and sort out their feelings on what had happened. All that was left now for those who remained was to move forward and get that bastard Heathcliff. Here's where things get tricky. Heathcliff did state after he was exposed that he believed the clear group that was present during the fight against the 75th floor boss should be able to make it to the end of the game. However, that was when Kirito and Asuna were still present with the clear group. Now that they were gone, I am unsure if he would make that statement again so confidently. I have already mentioned just how much of an impact they both had on the clearing, but another thing to consider is the loss of the dual wielding skill. Now, this is just my conjecture. I can't state this as fact, but I get the feeling that the endgame of Aincrad may have been balanced around the dual wielding skill in mind. Heathcliff had his own little narrative within Aincrad he was running. He handpicked a sort of chosen one who would receive this powerful unique skill and be at the forefront of the clearing, ultimately arriving at the Ruby Palace to stand before Kayaba in a duel to decide it all. But now, that key tool for the front line had died with Kirito, so perhaps without it, it would now be even more extremely difficult to make it through the rest of the game than intended. But then again, since it was Heathcliff himself who attempted to slay Kirito, maybe this isn't the case, and the game could be cleared fine without the dual blade skill. Because, as weird as this sounds, Kayaba was relatively fair. He upheld his word on everything, and the game was clearly designed to be finishable. He even helped contribute towards finishing it for the majority of the game as Heathcliff, so I feel he wouldn't take an action that would result in the game being impossible to finish for the front line, meaning that even without Kirito, and probably even Asuna too, escaping the Iron Prison should still be within the front line's power. So as they progressed through the 76th floor and beyond, much like when Kirito was missing from the 75th floor's clearing, it would take them noticeably longer to get through. And even though prior to the 75th floor, the front line had not taken any casualties in a boss fight since the 50th floor, I believe at least, to start with, casualties would become more common in a boss fight from the 76th floor onwards. The boss itself wouldn't be as hard as the 75th floor's one, as Heathcliff mentioned that the bosses on each 25 floor increment would be dramatically harder than the difficulty curve, which is why the 50th floor boss fight was a disaster in comparison to most of the boss fights they had done up until that point, and even following that point. But even though the boss itself wouldn't be as hard, there were two key factors that would make the fight much harder. The first being the lack of Asuna. As I mentioned before, she had organised most of the boss fights up until this point. With her sudden removal, I don't think they would be used to filling in what she had brought to the table just yet, resulting in preparation and strategy not being as solid as it was previously. The second key factor was from here on, every boss chamber was a non-teleport zone and the chamber was sealed when the fight began. Meaning, once the boss fight started, that was it. There was no retreating or escape, no second chances. You either win and live there and then, or lose and die a cruel death. A huge reason as to why the frontliners were able to go through all these boss fights with no casualties was not just that they themselves were strong, but also that they had sent scout parties to carefully examine and scout out as much of the boss's features as possible, allowing the clear group to then adjust accordingly with strategies and sometimes even specialized equipment based on this information. Now, scouting was impossible, so every boss fight from here on out would be done blindly, meaning that the clear group was now much more susceptible to getting cheesed or caught off guard by various moves or features of the boss fight that weren't expected, or maybe even hadn't been shown in the game up until this point, resulting in casualties becoming much more common in boss fights than they were previously. I think these casualties would be demoralizing for the front line. Remember, there were only 200-ish players serious about clearing the game at the front line, and that was prior to the 75th floor boss fight. They had lost 14 players in the 75th floor boss fight, as well as Kirito and Asuna after it, not to mention the players who retired from the clear group after deeming the clearing impossible when Heathcliff left. There may now only be around 160-ish players left at the front line. It was easy to believe that they could make it to the end when things were going well, and they were making it through the floors with nobody dying. But now, with the deaths piling up and their own mortality becoming painfully aware to the members of the front line, it would seem like a Herculean endeavour at best to finish the remaining floors. It could easily be any one of them to die next to some cheese in the boss fight, the thought of which was scary. Maybe they couldn't do it without Heathcliff after all. Maybe they were all doomed to be trapped here forever. Dark thoughts like this would creep into the minds of all those who remained at the forefront. I'm sure this realization of the cruel reality before them would cause more people to just quit, resigning themselves to their fate. But I believe despite all this, a good number of the clear group would choose to endure and push on. There are two reasons why I believe this. The first of which is there should be some who have strong motivations for wanting to return to the real world. For example, Agil had a wife who was waiting for him on the other side, who now had to run their business by herself, by the way. I'm sure motivations like this existed for others at the front line as well. Whether it be a lover, family, something they still wanted to do or achieve, something would drive them to keep moving forward. The second reason is something they can all relate to. They did not have an infinite amount of time left to live out their days in Aincrad. Hell, they probably didn't even have that long of a time to do so, as they were only so long that the hospitals could artificially keep the players trapped within, bodies alive until it was no longer possible. The day not so far into the future would eventually come where all the players would just die. If they wanted to live beyond that, finishing the game was their only choice. This is something deep down I think most of the players knew, hence why I think they would dare to defy their fate and strive for freedom. That being said, the road ahead would be long and grueling. The casualties wouldn't stop, but I do believe the rate of them would slow down. The frontliners would adapt and make adjustments to their new circumstances in order to improve their chances at survival. And while the game did get harder, they themselves would also get stronger. In a physical sense in terms of skills, levels and equipment, but also in a mental sense. At this point, only the most elite of the elite would be left standing. If the tragedies that had already occurred hadn't broke them, then there was likely nothing Aincrad could throw at them that would be able to do so. And so, through their best efforts, they would finally arrive at the 90th floor. When Heathcliff was exposed, he did mention that starting from the 90th floor onwards, the mobs would be exceptionally powerful. So now the rate of casualties would most likely increase again. Some frontliners may even die to just floor mobs before even getting to the boss, something that was a freak occurrence before this point. With this in mind, I think by the time they arrived at floor 100, there would not be that many of them left. In my Yuki what if, I estimated there would be around 25 players at this point. This time, with more people dropping out than in that timeline due to low morale, and Aincrad's protagonist no longer being present, it's likely there would be even less players in this timeline, probably only around 14. But they would not be deterred, as now they had finally reached the Ruby Palace. From the few illustrations we have seen, the 100th floor wasn't really a floor like the rest of them. It was mostly just the Ruby Palace itself, so there wouldn't be that much clearing to do before reaching Heathcliff. Finally, they could put an end to the devil that had trapped them within this hell full of tragedies, earning their freedom and in turn their ability to live out the rest of their natural lifespans. But they could not get careless. The Ruby Palace itself was quite large. They couldn't be certain if it was only Heathcliff there waiting for them. Maybe there would be floor mobs or even a mid-level boss waiting within it for them. And so, the remains of the clear group would make all preparations necessary, upgraded equipment, making sure they had the best available skills at their disposal, preparing any necessary items such as crystals or potions. Every last bit of coal they had would be sunk into the preparation for this final battle, as if they were to fail, they wouldn't be alive to regret the decision anyway, so there was no use in being stingy at this point. Since this could also be potentially the last day of their lives, the remains of the clear group would hold a feast among them. This would be to celebrate their efforts in making it to the final hurdle, to honour all those who fell along the way, to just take in and enjoy each other's company, as even if they were to succeed, this may be the last time that they ever see each other. Maybe they would even exchange stories as to what they planned to do once they got back to the real world, as this was the first time they could talk about it without it feeling like some faraway pipe dream after all. Even Klein and the remains of the Knights of the Blood would be chummy at this gathering. They had had their disagreements before, but none of that mattered now. All that was left was for them to band together and end the bastard who had taken those precious to them. The sun would rise, and with it, so would the clear group. They had made all preparations that they possibly could. Now all they could do was move forward. The final clearing would commence, and the remains of the front line would storm the Ruby Castle, taking on and defeating any mobs they may have encountered within. After much effort, they would finally arrive at the throne room. A silent acknowledgement would resonate throughout all of them as they prepared for themselves for what would certainly be the fight of their lives. Once they had steeled themselves, they would enter the throne room. Here they would find Heathcliff awaiting them. I imagine he would smile at both the fact that they had finally made it and that some of the members before him were Knights of the Blood. There would probably be some dialogue exchange between them. I have no doubt that the members would want to know why or just how he could do such a thing. If he knew how much suffering or sorrow he had caused, if he even cared. But inevitably, the climactic final duel would commence. Here's where things get tricky again. It's literally impossible to know the strength of Heathcliff for this final fight. There is no way he would be of a similar level to what he was when he left the clear group, as no matter what, a 1 versus 14 of almost certainly max level players was probably not favourable. They were missing the Dual Blades protagonist though, which would be a huge blow to their strength. Also, a loss for Heathcliff here would mean death, something I'm sure he's not willing to concede for free anyway. He would certainly power himself up to be the last boss. However, how much he does so though is impossible to predict. Perhaps he follows the difficulty curve and he only does so to the point where the remaining clear group could reasonably fight him, or perhaps he does so to the point of fighting him being a near insurmountable task. It's really hard to say. You can make up your own mind on which is more likely, but for me, well, as I mentioned before, Kayaba was relatively fair. So I believe he would follow the difficulty curve but spike above it somewhat. He was the boss of floor 100, which is not only the last boss, but is the boss on the 25 floor rotation, where every boss on that rotation has been dramatically harder than the difficulty curve. The front line had struggled and just barely prevailed at both the 50th and the 75th floor bosses. The former they managed to succeed due to Heathcliff's efforts, the latter they managed to succeed due to a combination of Heathcliff's, Kirito's and Asuna's efforts. All extremely exceptional players and none of them were present currently at the clear group side. So while there is probably a chance they could succeed, honestly I really don't think they would. There were just too few of them now, and even worse, the dual blades user was not among them, so the battle would be long and the frontliners would put forth a valiant effort. But ultimately, I think they would all be wiped in a tragic slaughter, dooming the rest of the players to be forever trapped within the Iron Prison, eventually dying due to their real-life bodies caving before they could muster a strong enough force to challenge the front line once more. Thank you for watching the video. Once again, I'm sure this will be a long one. Don't forget, this is all just my opinion, based on the lore of SEO and my interpretation of it. I tried my best to come up with what I thought was most likely, but hey, you may have your own opinions on the matter and that's fine. Feel free to leave them in the comments down below. I enjoy reading them and I'll reply to any ones that I find interesting. And lastly, please don't forget to like the video for more content like this or on any of my other interests. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye bye.